In tactical medicine, the minute that ruins you usually starts on paper. I'd been timing femoral bleeds on a rubber dummy when Admiral Sterling turned my med drill into an audit spectacle. He had 90 seconds left to make me look useless when my pager went off. Nobody in that room knew whether the alert would save a team, bury my career, or do both. I asked for Titan before Sterling finished saying my name. Before that buzz cut through the range bay, all I had was the dummy, the timer, and the ugly little fact that fake blood never stayed fake once it got on your hands. The training torso was laid out on cold concrete under fluorescent lights that hummed like they were too tired to stay alive. My knees had gone numb through my fatigues. The floor leached heat straight out of bone. I had 2 fingers pressed into the rubber groove where the femoral artery should have been, feeling for pressure that wasn't alive. I still managed to hate the slick drag of the gelatin blood pack when it burst under my palm. It was warm, in a cheap way, chemically warm. The room smelled like bleach, dust, rubber, old mop water, and desert grit blowing under the side door. Somewhere outside, a steel target rang once, thin, far off. Nobody said a word in the bay. They never did when somebody from inspection showed up. Silence got real obedient, real fast. Sterling's shoes told me it was him before the rest of him stepped into the light. Hard leather, clean soles. A measured pace that said he wanted every ear in the room on him. I didn't look up right away, kept pressure on the dummy, counted in my head, watched a rope of fake blood slide over the heel of my hand and splatter dark on the concrete. Then he stopped beside me and let the quiet stretch until it turned from discipline into theater. "Captain Jenkins," he said, like the title tasted bad, "this is what passes for readiness now?" I lifted my head. Sterling stood there with his uniform crisp enough to cut skin, one hand already worrying the edge of his sleeve, that little habit of his when optics mattered more than oxygen. He wasn't furious. That would have been easier. Fury was honest. He looked annoyed, which was worse. Like I'd spilled coffee on a spreadsheet he planned to present upstairs. He talked about audit optics, training visibility, command confidence, all that polished poison men used when they wanted to strip meat off a person without sounding emotional about it. He wanted witnesses. Wanted me on my knees in synthetic blood while he did the math out loud. I touched the scar at my left clavicle with the side of my wrist because both hands were busy and because sometimes the old ridge went cold as metal when I was deciding whether to break something or let it stay standing a little longer. It felt cold now. Sterling saw the motion and mistook it for nerves. People usually did. "You understand," he said, "that if this board concludes your judgment is compromised, reinstatement won't even make it to review." He said it for the room, not for me. Said it so the story would travel. Failed medic, fragile chain of command, liability in boots. I could have argued, could have stood up slick with red training goo and asked him how many men he'd watched bleed out while he polished language for a hearing. Instead, I kept pressure on the dummy and said, "Better paperwork than body bags." Just that. Dry, flat, enough to make a couple people in the shadows breathe through their noses like they were trying not to react. Sterling's eyes narrowed, not because I'd wounded him, but because I hadn't given him what he wanted. No scene, no raised voice, no emotional mess he could file under instability. He leaned down a fraction, close enough for starch and cologne, and the faint hot smell of a man who'd been awake too long protecting his career. "That line plays well with medics," he said. "It doesn't play with auditors." Then, the pager on my belt came alive with a hard analog buzz that sounded wrong in a room full of digital gear. Not a chirp, not a polite notification. A dead, ugly insect rattle against my hip. Everybody heard it. Sterling stopped in the middle of whatever measured little cut he'd been lining up next. The buzz hit again. Old school, dead man's switch. Ugly. Why now had an answer in those things? And it was never a good one. I released pressure from the dummy and the blood pack, coughed out one last red burp across my wrist. My hand came away sticky. The concrete bit colder once I stood. Sterling started to say something about protocol, routing, the chain. I was apparently supposed to die inside, but I was already unclipping the pager and reading the stripped-down call data on the tiny green screen. Emergency movement, 48-hour window, transport bay. I wiped my hand once on my pant leg, felt the fake blood tack over on my skin, touched the scar again, then looked straight at him. Authorize C-A-D, I said. He didn't answer fast enough. The buzz rattled a third time, louder in my head than in the room. Tighten, I said. Now! Transport bays always smelled like wet canvas, overheated brakes, and whatever the desert blew in through doors too big to seal right. At 0300, the place felt colder than the range had, though maybe that was just the sweat drying down my back under a fresh layer of irritation. My pager sat quiet now, which somehow made it mean more. The lights were brighter here. Worse, too. They flattened everything into hard edges and bad decisions. I stood by the striped concrete line outside the loading zone, scraping my thumbnail along the spine of my pocket knife. My nail dragged along the metal spine with a dry rasp. Small sound, mean little sound. It kept time better than a clock. The blade stayed folded. I wasn't looking to make anybody nervous. Not yet. The concrete under my boots held a warehouse chill, and the air had that clean, mean bite of bleach cut with oil and dust. I could still feel dried training blood in the creases of my fingers. Fake or not, it left a skin memory. I kept thinking about Sterling's face when the analog buzz went off. Not angry, interrupted. Men like that hated interruption more than disaster. The crate rolled in with one squealing wheel and a pair of gloved handlers I barely registered before they faded into the job and the dog became the only thing that mattered. Titan stepped out low and deliberate. 85 pounds of black-gray shepherd with a white slash on his chest and a muzzle gone pale around the edges. Retirement had silvered him, not softened him. His claws clicked over the cold concrete in a tight rhythm that echoed up the bay and into my ribs. Click, click, pause, click. Head level, tail already stiffening. He looked at me once, just once. And when I didn't move right away, he gave that leftward tilt of the head he'd had forever. Not cute. Never cute. Just calibration. You good or not? I crouched, and the old knife gave one last sharp rasp against my thumb before I pocketed it. My clavicle scar had gone cold again. Titan came close enough for me to feel the heat off him, the dusty animal smell under kennel soap and transport canvas. Then he pressed the damp front of his nose against the ridge under my collar for a second. Light, earned, no more than that. It hit me harder than Sterling had. I touched the top of his neck once, felt dense fur and old scar tissue under it, and stood before the moment could turn sentimental and stupid. Work, I said. That was all. Titan dropped his head, and the whole dog changed shape. Nose to concrete, shoulders rolling slow, breath pulling in shallow, precise drafts. The handlers let the lead slack without getting romantic about it. Good men. Or at least trained men. A transport guard near the inner gate shifted his weight, bored enough to miss what was happening. I saw the uniform before Titan got there. Standard desert camo with a sweat-darkened collar and a sleeve rubbed shiny at the cuff. The guy smelled like stale coffee and nervous skin from where I stood. Titan ignored both. He tracked in a narrow line across the floor, claws ticking, chest low, tail rigid as rebar. He passed a crate, doubled back half a step, then found the seam where the guard's hem brushed the concrete and froze there. His nostrils fluttered. A low growl. Not loud. It sat in the air like a motor idling somewhere inside his ribcage. Gun oil, I knew. Bleach, I knew better. Together, in that ratio, under fresh detergent and old sweat, they made the same metallic taste gather behind my teeth that I'd caught in passing near the surplus racks weeks ago and never proved. My thumb twitched toward the knife again and stopped. The guard started to ask what the hell the dog was doing. He got halfway through the first word before Titan snapped his head up and gave one sharp bark that cracked off the bay walls like a shot. No frenzy, no second bark, just the one indication, clean and mean and final. The guard went still. I did too, for half a breath, long enough to feel the fatigue clock begin in the back of my head. Dogs didn't get endless clean pulls in heat, noise, fuel stink, and fluorescent stress. Every minute from here cost him. That mattered. Everything was a budget in this place. Career, blood, scent, time. I stepped closer to the guard and saw a thin gray smear worked into the thread near the pocket seam, almost invisible unless you were looking for residue instead of dirt. Titan's tail stayed locked out. Another low vibration rolled through his chest. Not aggression for its own sake. Information. Useful, ugly information. I looked toward the bay doors, where the dark beyond them held the next hour like a closed fist, and I knew the drill on the dummy had been theater for something dirtier than theater. Sterling had wanted me small. Somebody else wanted a trail buried before daylight. I rubbed my thumb across the rough nail edge where the knife had worn a groove into it and said, mostly to myself, "That's not from cleaning solvent." Titan kept his nose up under the guard's hand, still waiting. First trace. First real crack in the seal. And now we had to move before the smell went thin. The tactical briefing room had the kind of cold that came from vents run too hard and men too tired to notice. It dried your eyes out and made the coffee taste scorched before it hit your tongue. Somebody had left a pot on the burner too long, so the whole room smelled burnt and bitter. Printer, heat, old laminate. The dry, unsmoked cigar Marcus Thorn liked to chew when his temper needed somewhere to go. The thing sat in the corner of his mouth now, dead and dark, softening under spit while he stared at the wall display like he could bully pixels into changing their testimony. On the cinder block wall behind him, a red placard read FOD in block letters. Foreign object debris. Keep the tiny bad thing off the airfield before it wrecked the expensive machine. I remember looking at it and thinking that was the whole building in one sign. A place built to fear the wrong kind of damage. Titan's alert was still in my ears, sharp as broken glass. The gray smear on that guard's uniform hadn't gone away because a door closed behind me. If anything, the room made it feel dirtier. Thorn didn't posture the way Sterling did. That was part of what made him harder to read. He was a working bastard. Broad through the shoulders, sleeves pushed once and left there, eyes bloodshot from too little sleep and too much triage of the bureaucratic kind. Not medicine. Money, optics, signatures, bodies moved on spreadsheets. He held a data pad in one hand, and the thing was vibrating hard enough for the glass to rattle against his ring. Incoming confirmations stacked up in the corner of the screen. Timestamps, route logs, access chain, all the little ghost systems left behind when men tried to move clean through dirty work. He angled the screen toward me, and I saw the mission entry highlighted in pale blue. One line of text with more weight in it than a loaded rifle. His jaw worked once around the cigar. "This should have died in transport," he said, a clipped sentence. Then a pause like the cigar had caught in his throat. "It didn't." He tapped the screen. "Now it dies here." I kept my face still. The old trick, calm enough to make other people explain themselves. The scar under my left clavicle had gone cold again, that little metal thread feeling under the skin. I touched it once with my knuckles, and Thorn's eyes flicked there, then back to the pad. He knew what he was asking. That was the problem. He knew. I said nothing for long enough to force him into honesty, or the closest version of it men like him ever offered. He looked past me at the door, then at the dead coffee pot, then back at the FOD placard like maybe the wall had a better answer. We all looked the other way once, Doc. The cigar flattened one syllable, made the sentence come out rougher, tired even. Not an apology, not a threat either. More like a confession he resented having to share. He pulled the cigar from his mouth, rolled it once between his fingers, then pointed the damp tip at the vibrating pad. Budgets got cut. He set the cigar down beside the scorched coffee pot and tapped the mission line with one knuckle. Assets moved. The data pad buzzed harder in his hand. Somebody signed off on a bridge and called it temporary. He shoved the screen closer, close enough for me to see my own authorization field waiting. Temporary became normal. He planted his thumb beside the prompt and stared at me. "You want to stay on this op? You don't make this line exist." There it was. Not cartoon evil. Worse. A man standing in the middle of a collapsing system, using his body to hold one beam up because if it fell now, it would crush everybody under it, including him. I hated him for that. Hated that some part of me understood it. The pad buzzed again. I could see my own name in the authorization field. Thumbprint required. My stomach went hollow in a small, efficient way. No drama. Just the body realizing the soul was about to take a bad deal. Thorn caught my wrist before I could decide too long. Not brutal, but hard enough to make the tendons light up. He planted my hand over the glass and forced my thumb down. The screen flashed white for a split second. Verification accepted. Then the terminal gave off one loud, sterile beep that sliced right through the room and left it emptier after. The line vanished. Just gone. A timestamp erased clean enough to make a liar out of anybody who came late to the story. Thorn let go of me like the contact burned. The cigar smell hung there, dry and acrid. I stared at the place where the file had been, and had the ugly thought that deletion always looked neat from the outside. The mess was what it did inside the person who agreed to it. "You're on wheels in under an hour," he said, voice flat now, already moving to the next disaster, because that was how men survived places like this. Hot zone, desert lane, K9 windows shrinking. I flexed my hand once, after he turned away and felt the pressure memory in my thumb. Then I slid 2 fingers under the edge of my vest, found the body cam housing near my ribs, and thumbed the hidden backup sequence I'd wired into it after my last internal review taught me what official storage was worth. No lights, no chirp, just a faint warmth against my side as the redundancy woke up and began keeping its own record. Thorn never looked back. Outside the briefing room, boots moved fast in the corridor, and somebody shouted for loadout. I looked one last time at the FOD sign on the wall and thought, too late, that sometimes the debris was the mission. By 2100, the desert had turned into a black mouth full of grit. The Black Hawk came in low enough to shake the dark loose from the ground. Rotor wash, flattening scrub, and kicking up sand that stung any patch of skin dumb enough to stay exposed. I was jammed into the bird with my knees braced against ribbed metal, headset biting one ear, the other ear losing a fight with engine noise and rotor thunder. Everything smelled like hot hydraulics, diesel exhaust, old canvas, and men sealed too long inside gear. Sweat had dried under my plate carrier and gone cold, leaving that salt-stiff itch between my shoulder blades you couldn't scratch without stripping half your body apart. Across from me, Thorn sat with his chin tucked, one gloved hand hooked through webbing, face half green under the cabin light and half erased every time the aircraft bucked. Nobody looked cinematic. We looked compressed, heavy. The floor vibrated through the soles of my boots, hard enough to blur the bones in my ankles. I could taste sand already, fine and bitter, sneaking past my teeth every time I opened my mouth to breathe. The pilot flared. Not pretty, not smooth. The aircraft shuddered sideways on a cross-push, and the whole cabin leaned with it. Somebody swore into the comms, and the words came through shredded by static. I leaned toward the open side and caught the desert in slashes. Night vision wasn't magic. It just turned bad information green. Heat still bled off the ground in pockets, enough to throw a soft boil into distance lines. Mirage at night looked different, but it still lied if you let it. Thermal lift rolling off rock shelves, wind slipping low along the cut, then climbing where the wash hit the basin wall. The team needed a lane that wouldn't drift them into loose stone and noise. Through the clutter on comms, I heard a marksman calling uncertainty, a tiny hesitation hidden under training. I keyed in and gave him what I had. Half-inch left, short. Then again, with a correction off a shimmer line, I caught near the ridgeline. Hold there. Lifts walking. The words felt small against the engine howl, but they went out clean enough. Thorn glanced at me once. Quick, nothing soft in it. Just acknowledgement and pressure sharing the same cramped seat for a second. Behind us, Titan's crate was cinched tight, and I didn't need to see him to know the dog could feel the clock closing in around his working window. When the skids kissed down, it felt less like landing than surviving an argument with gravity. We spilled out in a crouched rush, boots punching into sand that wanted to slide out from under every step. The rotor wash hit from behind and shoved heat, grit, and diesel into my mouth until my tongue felt sanded raw. My med bag yanked at one shoulder. Ammo and water dragged at my hips. Nothing fit gracefully. That was the point. Real movement never did. Thorn was already angling the team toward a dark fold in the terrain where the ground dipped enough to hide a body if it kept low. I ran bent under the wash, one hand on my headset, the other fighting the instinct to steady gear that was always trying to swing wrong. Comms crackled with partial words, bearings, distances. Somebody coughing, somebody asking for a repeat and getting rotor chop instead. The helicopter lifted off before we'd fully settled, leaving behind a deep, sudden hollow in the air. The kind of silence that isn't silence at all, just the desert taking its own space back. Without the rotors, I could hear grit ticking off goggles, fabric rasping at knees, the brittle rattle of dry brush brushing a boot. Sweat cooled so fast under the night air, it felt like a second skin peeling off. We moved in short bounds through the basin, all of us carrying the weight of the deleted timestamp, whether anyone wanted to name it or not. The missing line sat in my head like a swallowed nail. Every step made me more aware of the body cam backup warming against my ribs, tiny and secret and alive. Ahead, the ground climbed toward a broken shelf of stone, where the heat lines kept twitching just enough to mess with depth. I keyed the net again. Winds crossing off the right wall. Static bit the sentence in half. I tried again. Lower than it looks. Don't chase the shimmer. This time, it went through. The marksman answered with 2 clicks. Good enough. Titan's time limit pressed on all of it. Heat, fuel smell, rotor contamination hanging in the lane, dust settling into every fiber he'd have to work through. K9 window closing wasn't a figure of speech. It was chemistry and lungs, and the way scent died by degrees, while people pretended there was always one more minute to spend. Thorn dropped to a knee behind a slab of rock and signaled halt. I slid in beside him, chest heaving, sand grinding between my molars. Somewhere out ahead, beyond the next dark swell of ground, was the trail tied to that guard's uniform, and the line I'd helped erase to protect it. The desert gave nothing back for free. It just waited to see what we were willing to carry into it. The perimeter looked dead in the way bad places always did. Too still to trust. Too quiet to mean safe. We crawled the last stretch under a low run of broken wall, and vent piping that breathed heat in uneven pulses. Every few seconds, a wash of air rolled out from the compound and hit my face like an oven door cracking open, then vanished, leaving the night cold again everywhere the sweat had soaked through. Jet blast, stenciled in faded yellow on a metal warning plate bolted near the vent housing. The letters were half-eaten by sand, but still there, useful enough to kill you if you forgot them. Titan worked low beside me, head down, shoulders moving in slow, locked rhythm, tail straight as a ramrod. No drama, no mystical dog nonsense. Just lungs, chemistry, and a body trained to sort signal from noise while the desert tried to bury both. I tasted sand and old metal at the back of my mouth and realized it wasn't just the air. My jaw had gone tight again. Ahead, The outer wall of the target compound sat black against black, punctured by slit light and exhaust shimmer. Enemy ground, enemy layout, enemy logistics. Except Titan had already told me the smell on their side matched the residue from our own guard sleeve. That was the kind of truth that didn't arrive all at once. It came in hard little clicks. I watched Titan take the lane in segments. He checked the base of the vent housing, dismissed it, cut left along a strip of crusted gravel, then paused, where hot air from the exhaust slapped sideways across the ground and broke the scent apart. His claws scraped stone once. He reset, worked again. The rigid tail never softened. Neither did the line of his back. I stayed a half step behind him and let my own senses do what they could. Diesel drift from the insertion still clung low in the draw. Burnt dust. Dry sewage somewhere deeper in the compound. Machine oil from the vent motor. Then, under it, so thin I almost doubted it, the same bleach and gun oil compound that had hit me in the transport bay. Sharp, clean, and filthy at the same time. Industrial wipe over weapon maintenance. Sterile on top of violent. I froze for 2 seconds, exactly long enough to let the metallic taste rise under my tongue and tell me I wasn't imagining it. My stomach didn't drop. That would have been too simple. What happened was colder. Pieces slid together. Supply leakage. Repacked inventory. Friendly material washing up behind hostile walls. Somebody inside our system wasn't just skimming. They were feeding the fight, then handing people like me the mop and paperwork after. Titan lifted his head and gave one sharp bark toward a service door sunk into the wall. The sound snapped off the concrete and came back flatter. Indication, same compound, deep inside. I kept my breathing even because panic had no field value, and outrage even less. Somewhere behind me, men shifted into firing positions, but I didn't turn to check who was ready. Not yet. The only thing that mattered was preserving what I had before it got buried under gunfire, and whoever wrote the official version later. My hand slid under the edge of my vest, like I was checking a strap. Instead, I found the body cam housing warmed from the hidden backup I'd armed in the briefing room. One press on the recessed switch gave me a tiny pulse against my fingers. Live audit trail opened. No screen, no visible light, just a silent confirmation moving upstream to wherever the redundancy stored, things the pretty systems forgot to keep. I angled my torso enough to catch the warning plate, the vent shimmer, Titan's rigid profile, and the service door he'd marked. Evidence wasn't dramatic when it was real. It was alignment, smell, sequence, location. The body wanted to shake after a realization like that. Maybe shout, maybe run the conclusion past somebody with more rank so you could spread the blame around. I did neither. Thorn was somewhere behind the line, and I wasn't stupid enough to confront him in the dark with half the truth and all the wrong witnesses. If he knew, this wasn't the moment. If he didn't, the wrong sentence could kill the only clean chain I had. So I stayed quiet and let the camera drink. Then the heat wash changed. Stronger. A hard lateral push from the vent throat that rippled the shimmer and smeared dust low across the rocks. Jet blast again. Only this time it carried more than temperature. It carried the deeper chemical note out in a single ugly exhale. And Titan answered with another sharp bark, louder now because the source was close and the window was shrinking fast. I touched the scar at my clavicle through my shirt without thinking. Cold ridge under hot skin, then keyed my mic low enough that only the inner net would catch it if the static behaved. Trace confirmed, I said. Nothing else. No accusations. No speeches. My mouth still tasted like metal. My thumb stayed over the body cam switch a second longer, making sure the live trail held. Out beyond the service door, somewhere inside the compound, something heavy clanged and stopped. Not a warning. Not yet. More like a machine being moved off routine at the worst possible moment. Titan locked onto the door seam and leaned into the lead, chest vibrating with a low growl he never wasted, unless the signal got clean enough to hurt. That was when I knew the reframe was complete. We hadn't followed contamination into enemy space. We had followed our own fingerprints there. And once a truth like that started breathing, contact usually came right behind it. Contact started as a flicker and turned into punishment before anybody had time to name it. The service door banged wide. White light sheared across the yard, and muzzle flashes punched through it so fast they looked like a zipper opening in the dark. Rounds cracked over the rocks and smacked the wall behind us in flat, ugly pops that sprayed grit across my cheek. Somebody to my left yelled, "Not a command, just raw surprise getting cut in half by incoming fire." Titan hit the ground on instinct and disappeared behind cover with his handler, which was exactly right, and still somehow felt like losing one of the few honest sensors on the field. I dropped hard behind the vent base, shoulder slamming hot metal, teeth ringing from the impact. The air changed shape under gunfire. Smoke got into it, burned propellant, scorched dust, hot iron, the bitter aftertaste of your own adrenaline coming up the throat. Comms detonated in my ear with overlapping voices and static, each one demanding somebody else make sense of the mess first. Then a body crashed into the rocks 3 feet ahead of me and stayed there wrong. One of ours. Down on his side, leg trapped under him, rifle gone somewhere I couldn't see. He made a strained sound when he tried to move. I got to him low and ugly, crawling more than running, dragging my med bag on straps that caught every damn edge on the way. Rounds were still clipping stone overhead. Light flashed. Dark returned. Flashed again. His gloves scrabbled at the gravel when I rolled him enough to find the bleed. Hot blood had already sheeted down over the thigh panel and soaked the Kevlar skirt slick. It felt different from the fake stuff on the dummy, and different from the training memories people like to compare it to. Real blood had weight and heat and a kind of determination to it. It kept going. My gloved hand slid the first time I tried to get pressure where it needed to be. The second time I pressed hard into the groove high on his leg, found the femoral line by feel and pressure and the body's own frantic map, then bore down until his whole frame jerked under me. He cursed through clenched teeth. Good. Cursing meant air. Meant brain. The radio screamed for sitrep so loud through the headset it felt detached from the human world. Static and demand. Static and demand. My fingers were slipping again. Hot slickness worked under the glove seams and across the heel of my hand. I shifted, braced my knee into rock, and pressed harder. The slow part came then, the awful, clean slice of time that opened in the middle of chaos. People think panic speeds everything up. It doesn't always. Sometimes it sharpens one task until the rest of the world turns distant and stupid. I could feel the pulse hammering against my fingertips. Feel it weaken, surge, weaken again. Kevlar rough under blood. Uniform fabric bunching. The man's breath hitching against a busted rhythm of gunfire and radio static. My own heartbeat banging at the base of my throat so hard it made the scar under my clavicle throb cold. I could smell his fear under the propellant, could smell my own too, mixed with plastic from my kit and the mineral smell of the fresh wound. The radio kept shrieking for an update, each burst of static so sterile it might as well have come from the datapad in Thorn's hand. Same voice of the machine. Same demand to make the paperwork happen while the body was still arguing with death on the floor. I snatched the handset off my vest with my free hand, listened to one more barked request, dissolve into white noise, and let it drop into the gravel. Against regs, against chain, against every neat little after-action somebody would want later. Necessary. My mouth was close to the wounded man's ear when I heard myself say it. Bleeding controlled. Comms dropped. Not controlled. Not all the way. Not in the clean sense. But slowed. enough for the next second to exist. That was control in the real world. I shifted pressure and felt the line answer under my fingers with a weaker thud. Better. The wounded man's hands stopped clawing at the dirt and grabbed at my forearm instead, hard enough to hurt, good again. Pain meant he was still in here with me. More rounds hammered the wall behind us. Stone spat fragments into my back. Somebody farther inside the compound dumped a burst that rolled off the corridor like a circular saw hitting rebar. I stayed where I was, bent over him, shoulder blades hunched, body making itself into cover because there wasn't anything else to be. No heroic return fire, no cool-headed movie line, just pressure, breath, and the ugly little arithmetic of how long I could hold this before somebody reached us or the blood found a new way out. The body cam at my ribs was still warm, still running, catching every broken second whether I wanted it to or not. Behind the noise in front of me lived the worst thought, the one the scent had planted and gunfire couldn't drown out. If our own chemicals were in their walls, maybe our own permissions had opened the route. The man under my hands groaned and tried to curl around the pain. "Stay here," I said, which was a stupid thing to tell somebody who physically couldn't go anywhere. Then movement flashed in the doorway ahead, low and fast, and the night stopped being about evidence long enough to become about surviving the next 10 feet. The movement in the doorway vanished before I could turn it into a face. Muzzle flashes, stitched white holes through the dark, and the wall over us spat grit into my hair. I stayed bent over the wounded man, applying steady pressure where the artery ran deep in his thigh, feeling for that ugly weak beat that meant he was still here. My glove was slick. Kevlar under my palm felt rough and hot and useless at the same time. The radio in my headset had gone past chaos into something flatter, colder, a stack of voices crushed under static and range distortion until none of them sounded fully human anymore. Then I felt the body cam at my ribs, warm against my vest, not heat from my skin. A pulse, a wake-up. Across the broken yard, Thorn rose behind a cracked slab of concrete with his datapad braced against his forearm, trying to force order into a firefight by sheer refusal to admit the world had already slipped. The screen jittered in his grip from near impacts. Then it started vibrating on its own, sharp and hard enough that I heard the plastic chatter even through gunfire. For one fraction of a second, everything around that screen seemed to pull tight and hold its breath. The alert hit across the comms channel a second later. Piercing. Synthetic. A clean machine scream dragged over the net with no regard for bullets, cover, or whether anybody on that frequency was busy trying not to die. It cut through everything. The men on the line heard it. The shooters deeper in the compound heard it. Thorn heard it and looked down at the screen with the kind of expression people get when a sealed room starts filling with water. My body cam backup had found his datapad through the shared system architecture, and the system had done what systems did when nobody designed them to understand shame. It compared the live audit trail to the erased mission record and surfaced the mismatch. Deleted timestamp. Root conflict. Sync exception. The line he had forced out of existence in the briefing room was back now. Not as paper, not as rumor, but as a machine-level contradiction shrieking over an open channel. The wounded man jerked under my hands at the sound, and I leaned harder into the pressure point, forcing my arm not to slip. Stone dust kept pattering down over us. Somewhere to the rear, someone yelled to kill the alarm before it walked enemy fire straight onto our position. "Shut it down, Doc!" Thorn's voice tore over the channel, clipped and raw and furious, for the most practical reason in the world. Not guilt, not confession, noise, discipline. Exposure. Survival. He slapped the datapad with one hand and clawed at the interface with the other while rounds snapped over his cover. For one fast, ugly second, I saw the whole shape of it. No mastermind hack, no hidden genius cracking the code. Just a bureaucratic system built to preserve process, colliding with a bureaucratic lie built to bury one line item. The deleted timestamp had become the target of every patch, every override, every quiet fix, until the architecture narrowed around it and stopped seeing the wider problem. That was the mistake. Not the data itself, the obsession. Target fixation, I heard myself say, low and flat, like I was naming a wound while the patient was still bleeding. Too much focus on the chosen threat, too little awareness of everything around it. Thorn either heard me or didn't. Didn't matter. The datapad screamed again across the net, colder this time because I knew exactly what it meant. The system wasn't betraying them. It was only refusing to forget. I couldn't move to help him, even if I'd wanted to. The wounded man's blood kept pooling under my glove, and every twitch of his body threatened to reopen what little control I'd bought. Thorn finally ripped the battery pack loose with a brutal twist that looked more like field stripping than troubleshooting. The alarm cut off mid-cycle. The silence that followed lasted maybe half a breath before the old noises rushed back in to claim the space. Gunfire. Boots scuffing rock. Somebody coughing into a dead mic. Then, from off to our flank, Titan gave a low warning growl that reached me even through the mess. Tight. Focused. Ambush signal. Useful, as always. Thorn looked at me through dust and flashlit dark. One hard glance that said he knew I understood too much now to be walked back into ignorance later. He said nothing. Neither did I. My body cam was still warm. The duplicate trail had already gone somewhere outside his grip. I bent lower over the wounded man, checked the weak pulse still answering under my fingers, and listened as fire from a new angle started raking the yard. The audit had gone live. The battlefield was reacting to the sound of the truth. We peeled off the position in fragments, dragging the wounded with us, and pretending that counted as a clean withdrawal. The extraction route ran through a wash full of broken rock, scrub, and loose sand that slid under every step like it had opinions about who got out alive. My forearm throbbed from holding pressure too long. Blood had dried tacky at the wrist of my glove. Ahead, Titan moved with the front element, still on task, still reading the route, but the cost of it had started to show. His head rode lower. His mouth stayed open longer between checks. Each breath came heavier, wet and fast, with that hard-working chest pull you heard in dogs when training had carried them right up to the edge of what their lungs could cache. Severe fatigue wasn't theatrical. It was mechanical, tiny delays, heavier footfalls, slower processing on every gust of air. Behind us, rounds cracked blind across the rocks. Ahead, the wash bent into a narrow notch, where the wind funneled scent and sound into one ugly throat. Titan hit that turn and slowed on his own. Claws scraped stone. His tail went rigid again, but the signal moved through a tired body now, not a fresh one. He lowered his head into the wind channel, panting hard enough I could hear the drag of it over boots, gear, and the wounded man's ragged breathing behind me. Then the growl came, very low. So low it felt less like sound than vibration. A warning rolled out from deep in his chest and kept tight because he didn't have air to waste. Ambush path. Maybe not certainty, but enough. The handler gave him lead. The rest of us almost bunched without meaning to, which was how people got slaughtered on extraction. Not because they lost nerve, but because exhausted bodies loved the same narrow ground at the same time. I touched the scar under my left clavicle, and the ridge felt cold as metal against my sweat-slick skin. My nails bit into my palm. The old trick, pain to keep the head level. Calm was never calm. It was fear held in a better container. I leaned toward Titan's line, kept my voice low and steady, and said, "Easy, Titan, hold the line." He didn't look back. Good. He didn't need comfort. He needed room to work. The growl stayed there, tighter now, while the handler shifted half a step left and let me read the terrain around the warning instead of through it. Once I did, the notch turned ugly in all the ways that mattered. Rock shoulder on one side, trash slope on the other, narrow lane, bad elevation, a tidy little kill box if somebody sat above it and waited for us to funnel in. I gave a quiet reroute with 2 fingers and a low word over the net. Left around the scrub pocket. Stay under the broken shelf. Avoid the throat. The wounded man made a wrecked noise behind me each time his carrier stumbled over stone. Titan moved again, but slower now. Slow track for real. Not caution, but biology. His paws landed heavier. His panting turned rougher, open-mouthed and wet. Still, he kept giving us the only thing he had left to give. Directional truth. No miracle rush, no attack charge, just warning, recheck, warning again. The kind of work that looks small until you noticed it was keeping people off the exact patch of ground where they would have died. We pushed through the alternate line with the whole column stretched thin and ugly. The basin floor was ankle-breaker terrain, all broken stone and dead brush that grabbed straps and scraped fabric loud enough to make you feel exposed, even when nobody had eyes on you. Behind us, somebody fired a short burst toward the original notch. Answering fire came back almost at once from above, right where Titan's growl had marked it. Confirmation. Useful, not satisfying. The night air cooled the sweat on my back into a raw chill, while sand inside my boots chewed both heels open by degrees. Titan stumbled once, corrected, and kept moving, with his head down and his shoulders working too hard under the harness. I matched my pace to his warning cadence and kept us off the ambush lane, one decision at a time. Somewhere beyond the next rise waited extraction, assuming command still wanted us alive with the live audit trail riding the network. I didn't let that thought stay long. The handler kept Titan moving. I kept the route clean. Behind us, the wounded man kept breathing, which was enough for the next second. We weren't getting out elegant. We were borrowing inches from a tired dog and a dark piece of ground that hadn't killed us yet. By the time we hit the extraction LZ, nobody looked like they belonged to a victory. The bird was already in a hover, kicking sand sideways in hard, dirty sheets that stung the eyes and packed into teeth. Rotor wash shoved heat and cold across the same stretch of ground. 1 second, oven breath off the engine housings. The next, a dry slap of night air against sweat-soaked gear. I stayed low with the wounded man until the flight crew got hands on him. Titan folded down near the skid with his chest pumping, still alert but running on whatever part of a good dog came after fatigue. My forearm had locked up from the pressure hold. Blood had dried in the seams of my glove and turned my hand into a stiff red shell. Somebody yelled for manifest. Somebody else yelled back that the manifest could wait until the living were inside. Then one of the crew chiefs pointed at the portable comm screen, bolted beside the open door. Incoming priority video. Secure channel. I knew before the face resolved whose face it would be. Men like Sterling never missed the moment, when survival and theater briefly became the same job. He came up on the screen through a veil of breakup and rotor wash interference, his image pixelated at the edges every time the signal caught a fresh blast of airborne grit. Admiral Vance Sterling. Perfect color. No dust, no blood, no sign that 2 hours earlier he tried to pin me to the floor of a training bay for audit optics. Behind him, out of focus, I caught the glow of a server wall and a line of staff shapes pretending not to listen. His eyes went first to the identifiers crawling beside the feed, not to me. That told the whole story. Bodycam ingest verified. Direct upload to IG server. Chain preserved. Unfakeable sign. He had not joined the call because he had found his conscience. He had joined because the evidence had arrived somewhere outside his control, and now his chair was in the blast radius. His mouth tightened once. Small, fast, the sort of twitch a civilian would miss and an auditor would call meaningless. It meant calculation. He looked at the timestamp markers, at the recovery conflict flag from the live sync, and then finally at me. Not warm, not hostile either. Just measuring how much damage had already become official fact. The feed shimmered once, broke into coarse blocks, then stabilized. Rotor wash thudded around us. Titan lifted his head and then lowered it again. Sterling gave the extraction order in the same tone he might have used to approve toner cartridges. Immediate lift, casualty priority, evidence chain locked, pending internal review. That phrase landed on the screen and sat there like frost. Internal review, the machine's favorite burial cloth. He asked for no heroics, offered no praise, and that honesty almost counted as respect. Then he did something that made the crew chief beside me go still for half a beat. Sterling raised one hand and delivered a stiff salute through the screen. No softness in it, no gratitude. A signal. That was all. Formal recognition that I had become real enough on the record to require ceremony before disposal. I returned nothing. My shoulders hurt too much, and my patience even more. A sealed envelope appeared in his hand from off-screen, plain white, marked with the Internal Affairs stamp across the flap. He held it up to camera first, because even punishment had to be documented when optics were involved, then passed it forward to the crew chief at my side. The man took it like it might explode. Sterling looked directly into the lens when he spoke. "Your access is revoked, Captain. Effective immediately. Clean line. No anger. No room to argue." He was extracting us because the feed had forced him to. He was cutting me out because the same feed had made me dangerous. I took the envelope with my stiff hand and felt how light it was. Paper never weighed what it meant. The flap was already sealed. Compartmentalization. That was the trick. Not to deny the truth outright. Just fence it. Split it into rooms. Remove the one person who had seen the whole shape of it, and make sure every future door required a badge she no longer had. On the screen, Sterling said something about continuity of operations, then stopped because he knew I understood the dialect beneath the words. Continuity meant the system would survive. Operations meant it would survive by digesting the evidence, disciplining a few shadows, and freezing everything that might embarrass a budget or a flag officer. He cut the salute line first, then the video. Just like that, he was gone, leaving only my reflection in the black glass and the sound of the helicopter swallowing the rest. The crew chief shoved the envelope into my vest pocket because both my hands were busy helping load the wounded. Titan dragged himself up when I moved and pressed against my leg long enough to steady, then followed. Behind the noise and the dust and the rotor chop, the real lesson sat quiet and finished in my head. Authority had reversed just enough to protect itself. The truth had made it to the server. I had made it off the ground. The system had already begun deciding how to keep both facts from changing anything that mattered. At 0600, the desert finally admitted it could be cold. Night let go by degrees, the black draining out of the perimeter fence, and the low scrub until everything turned the color of old ash. I sat alone on an ammo crate outside the temporary med shelter, with my jacket half-zipped and my collar up, though the wind still found the gap at my throat and pushed fingers of cold straight down my spine. The base had that thin dawn quiet military places sometimes got between catastrophe and paperwork, when generators hummed, distant engines coughed awake, and nobody had started lying out loud yet. My pocket knife rode the wet stone in my hand with a dry, mindless rhythm. Steel scraped across the whetstone, paused, then ground against the grit again. The sound was small enough to vanish in the wind, but close up it had its own teeth. I kept doing it because my hands needed a job, and because sharpening steel felt more honest than opening the sealed envelope in my vest. Sand had dried in the seams of my boots. Blood had dried in the cracks of my knuckles. The wind smelled like dust, aviation fuel gone cold, and the faint antiseptic leak from the aid station behind me. Nothing about it felt clean. Titan lay beside my right boot in a long, tired sprawl, black-gray coat dulled with dust, ribs lifting and falling slow now instead of hard. He looked older in dawn light than he had under fluorescent bays or rotor wash. Not weak, just used. His chin rested across the toe of my boot, like he had measured the exact amount of contact either of us could stand. Every now and then, he let out a breath that stirred grit against the leather. No theatrics, no soulful movie stare, just weight and warmth and the fact that he was still here. I kept working the blade. The metal ground against the stone in a slow, punishing rhythm. My thumbnail had worn a groove into the handle overnight from too much pressure. Somewhere across the yard, a forklift backed up with a flat warning beep. Somewhere else, a sergeant was already turning names into columns. I could have opened the envelope then, could have read the language making my future smaller. Instead, I watched the sun begin to bruise the horizon and thought about Sterling on the screen, the stiff salute, the dead voice he'd used to revoke me. He hadn't lied, not exactly. That was the elegance of it. The feed had reached the IG server. The evidence was real. The extraction had happened, and still the room the truth entered had been built by the same people who needed it contained. I finally opened the envelope when the knife edge was sharp enough to catch the first weak light. Inside was one sheet. Temporary suspension of access pending compartmentalized internal action review. Temporary, the page said, in the same way a locked door was temporary if you lived long enough outside it. Effective immediately. Need to know restrictions. Records. Segregation. Personnel contact limitations. Sterile phrases. All of them. You could spend a whole career inside that kind of language and never once have to use the words betrayal or cover-up. But that was what it was. The corruption had not been disproved. It had been sealed, frozen into an internal shape the institution could study in private, prune in private, survive in private. I folded the paper back along the original crease and put it away. The knife kept moving. The steel hissed sharply against the whetstone, a harsh and steady drag. The sound was starting to get under my skin now, but I let it. Better that than hearing again the sink alarm from the compound, or Thorn roaring over it, or the wet breath of the man under my hands, while the radio demanded a version of events neat enough to file. The system loved neatness more than truth. Truth only got welcomed when it could be boxed, stamped, and stripped of access credentials. Titan shifted, lifted his head off my boot, and for a second I thought he was just repositioning to spare his joints. Instead, he leaned in close enough for me to feel the damp heat of his nose before it touched the scar under my left clavicle. A small nudge. Wet, careful. The same old ridge that went cold under stress felt colder for a beat, then warmed under the contact. I stilled the knife in mid-stroke and let the moment happen without dressing it up into something it wasn't. He was tired. I was tired. Somewhere in the animal math of habit and trust, he had decided to check the place on me that always went hard before the rest of me did. I put 2 fingers into the fur behind his ear and left them there. No speech, no promise that tomorrow would be cleaner. Dawn widened over the wire and showed the base for what it was. Functional, busy, absolutely capable of swallowing a scandal and calling the process integrity. Titan settled his chin back onto my boot. The wind kept moving across the perimeter, cold and indifferent. I drew the knife once more over the stone. A final, rough scrape of metal cut through the chill. Then I looked out at the pale line of morning and understood the final price with a clarity that felt almost restful. The truth had survived. I had not been allowed to keep a place inside the system that buried it. Trust, once cut that deep,